All right, we are going. So, thank you everybody for showing up. I'm going to be admitting people in from the waiting room all throughout this. So if I look a little distracted here, it's because I'm constantly admitting people in. Everyone should be muted, as I was just mentioning, if people just showed up. Um, but otherwise, this is Ken and I just having a informal chat. We had a few ideas of stuff we'll talk about. There's going to be a everyone can type into chat with questions. That's kind of how this is going to go. So, Ken, you got anything you want to start off with?
Happy to talk with you. We always have wonderful discussions when you and I are chatting. It'll be interesting to see whether the topics we talk about are interesting to all of the people that have joined in, but I'm hoping they will be. So I'm glad to be here.
I have no doubt. Look, I could probably go walk away and let you chat with everybody and they would be thrilled. You are 99% of the reason why everybody's here is they want to hear stuff that you have to say. And I'm here to just facilitate most of that as much as possible. But I absolutely love getting to chat with you. We've had great, God, it's going on. I think we met for the first time at ABMA. Was that 2000? Summer of,
I know it's probably it's been a long time. I mean, it's been quite a few number of years, that's for sure.
yeah, it wasn't that long after you had written the 99 book.
Yeah.
Um, and I still remember, so there was a social, it was like a patio or something like that. So I think it was still my first year of being a graduate student at UNT. I think I had started Orca. I think Orca was about 6 months old at that point.
Uh-huh.
And you had no idea who I was. You had no idea. Like I think I just walked up to you and I think I just said, "So, where do you sit on this whole one-to-one click treat thing?" All right, it said something like that. I just remember you looking at me like, "That's a like." I don't think I even introduced myself. I just came up and
That sounds about the way it was. Yes, it was just a question out of the blue, and I wasn't sure the context or the reason you were asking it. It was just simply, oh, okay.
right. It was just no ice. It was, well, breaking ice, I guess, but it was just jackhammering through the ice. But it started. It made for really wonderful conversation. That said, I guess we can. One of the things I'm most excited to talk to you about, because we haven't spent that much time talking about this, is training in relation to conservation. And I wanted to start you off there. I know a couple. I've heard you talk a little bit about the work you've done in Africa with the elephants, but I'll let you take it from there because.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic, and you're right. You get me going on conservation training, and we could take up the entire hour and a half and still not have left time for questions. So I'll try to temper my enthusiasm and just talk a little bit about the idea. Training and conservation often don't appear to go hand in hand. It's not unusual for wildlife biologists to discount training as having any place in managing wildlife. But often it's because they don't understand what training is. They don't understand the various ways that it can be applied. And and I think that's often the challenge I face as a trainer my whole life, whether it be in the zoo world, although training has become much more common and much more accepted today in the zoo world. When I first started out, unless you were training an animal for a show, there was no, why would you train an animal? The idea of husbandry training and training for
Yeah.
welfare hadn't really come to fruition. And, um, and so the same is true in the wildlife world. And but if you look historically at the work that zoos and aquariums do, It has not been unusual to see a zoo really working toward uh, conservation efforts. That's always been a goal of a lot of zoos, but
Absolutely.
actually finding ways of using behavioral management to help. And one of the very first examples that really stands out that was proven to be very successful was the California Condor project.
Yeah.
In the early 1970s, um, the fact of the matter was that there were like 21 or 22 California condors left in the world, in the wild, in zoos. Total, it was 22 animals. And the Los Angeles Zoo and the San Diego Zoo really worked hard to increase their breeding success. But after they had their successes with breeding, their early attempts to reintroduce animals to the wild failed because the birds were imprinted on people. And so they hung out at where people were, and they weren't going out being wild, um, wild bird. And it wasn't until they gathered together a group of trainers to really work on the best way to train and condition the birds for reintroduction to the wild, did we start seeing real success. And I remember that was one of the things that really inspired me as a trainer, is seeing that the effort of people with behavior knowledge really made a difference in seeing the success of that California Condor project. And today there are hundreds and hundreds of birds in the wild now, breeding on their own, living on their own, because of the success of that early project. And if you go back in history, there have been so many wonderful examples of different ways that people have used behavior knowledge to aid in conservation. It just doesn't seem to be in the mainstream consciousness. It doesn't seem to be something that people talk about a lot or are aware of. But if you go into the literature and look at the work that's being done, there have been a lot of different ways in which behavioral knowledge is being used. And I think part of the challenge there is training has so many misconceptions that people avoid using the word training, and instead look for other ways of talking about how an animal got accustomed to something or got desensitized to something and how that introduction took place. And they never thought of the process as being a training process. But in recent years, I've been involved in a number of projects that were very, very much about training. It included uh, a chimp project in Sierra Leone, a polar bear project in Alaska, an elephant project that I'm involved in right now in Zambia, in which we are using our knowledge of animal behavior to change the behavior of animals in a way that will help them. The elephant project is the most notable of those, in which a group of elephants in Zambia, it's approximately a 400 a member herd of elephants, make a regular migration north to Tanzania. And in that route, they cut through the Democratic Republic of Congo. They literally are in the Democratic Republic of Congo for a few hours. But Zambia has really strict protection against poaching, but the Democratic Republic of Congo does not. And every year, as these elephants pass through the Democratic Republic of Congo, 50, 60, 70 elephants were being slaughtered every single year. And for a period of about 20 years, biologists, conservation organizations were making efforts to try to work with the poachers, to work with the Democratic Republic of Congo to change that behavior, and it wasn't happening. And it finally, because of the work that I had done with polar bears and with several other species of animals, I was contacted to see if we could come up with a plan that might help train the elephants to change their migration route to avoid going through the Democratic Republic of Congo. We spent 7 years getting the permits and doing the environmental impact studies to determine if this was going to be a viable project. And we finally got the permission to start the project in 2017. However, we weren't able to start in 2017 because poachers got word of what we were doing, and our team or party came under attack, and 5 of us were hospitalized and pretty seriously injured. And it looked like that whole project was going to get derailed. Um, but all of us involved, we recovered. Our resolve was to continue with the project and try to do what we could to continue with the project, and we finally got it started in 2018, and we just completed the 2020 version of the project. So every year, 2018, 2019, and 2020, those 3 years, we have implemented the project of diverting the elephants on a new route. The hard thing about this project, of course, is the elephants migrate that direction only once per year. They have a circular migratory route, so they come back a different direction.
Right.
Um, but what that means is we have a permit now for 10 years. And that seems like a long time. But when you realize the animals only pass that way once a year, you really have 10 approximations. So when I think about training my dog, I can do 10 approximations in 5 minutes.
Right.
But with these elephants, we have one approximation per year, and trying to change a centuries old migration route would seem to be a difficult process. And trying to do it with that large a number of elephants would also seem to be a hard process. But it isn't actually as difficult as it might seem. Elephants operate on a matriarchal society that is very, very strong. And if you are able to train the matriarch to change its path, all of the other elephants seem to follow along with her. And so it really was focusing on one elephant. We do have to manage the entire herd of elephants. But what was wonderful about it, and I don't have the statistics in front of me, but every year the average number of elephants that have been killed through by poachers was approximately 55, 60 animals every year that were killed. In 2018, there were only 4 animals killed. In 2019, there were only 6 animals killed. In 2020, there were only 5 animals killed. And none of those were killed through poaching. They were through natural death. And so it was the first time that no poaching had taken place in this population, and we've been successful with that for 3 years. But most importantly, the population for the past 20 years has steadily declined. And in 2019, after 1 year of the project, it was the very first year that that particular population had seen an increase in the total number of elephants in that population. And we saw another increase again this year in 2020. And so the Zambian government is very happy. Elephant Conservation International is very happy. We are being very, very successful with this particular project. And so I actually even have hope that we can actually get the animals, because what our goal is, we have to change the route and quit helping them by the end of 10 years. Now, I believe that if we show success but aren't quite able to get rid of all the prompts, we might be able to extend the permit by an additional period of time. But after the success of this year, after only 3 years, I'm feeling far more confident that we can see successes in this project in the 10-year period that's been allotted to us. So we've had a lot of different complications, and not the least of which was this year with COVID-19. I was given permission to travel to Zambia for the project this year, but I would have had to go through a fairly lengthy quarantine period. And we decided that I would try to run the operation from right here where I'm sitting right now. And so we actually were able to be successful with the project this year. And I was able to do it remotely. And that was really exciting. So I'll stop for a moment because I don't know if you might have questions. I've kind of glossed over a lot of information, and I'm probably
Yeah.
talking very excitedly. So I'll pause for a
Yeah.
moment and see if you
No,
have.
no worries, Ken. You are supposed to be doing the majority of the talking, and I'm here to facilitate some of that and then throw in some stuff here and there. I'm trying to let some people in. I was going to say, you mentioned the fact of having just a few trials really to work, which I think that's pretty typical in conservation related work, is that And that's part of what makes it even that much more difficult from a training standpoint, is that you get so few opportunities. I was going to throw this back to, because you were talking about the California Condor project, and some of the predecessors to that actually came from the falconry world, with the peregrines. And it was anytime I get a chance to shout out to the falconry world, I do. And they really, I mean, it was master falconers, and they're working with peregrines that brought peregrines back from their severely threatened, endangered status, and a lot of that went into knowing what they know about that to then go into California condors. But even while at least while some of that was happening, then Garcia and his colleagues were doing work on taste aversion with wolves for conservation related stuff, and that was one of the things that so these are academic researchers, respondent conditioning guys, Pavlovian conditioning guys, and they're doing taste aversion. So what's happening is this is going on in the 50s, 60s. I think Garcia started doing his work maybe in the 60s, where you had wolves, coyotes going in and killing sheep, killing livestock, and they were being killed because of it. So they had to come up with an answer real quick, and one of those answers was, you know what, let's use what we know about taste aversion conditioning to actually get these wolves to avoid sheep. And it was pretty amazing, some of the stuff they did. So there's been interesting stuff along those lines.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that as I've looked into it and been involved in conservation training, I've looked into the literature, and there are many examples, but it's amazing to me how seldom they refer to it as training,
Right.
or talk about it in the forms of teaching an animal something. They may use the word conditioning, they may use a variety of different things, but you have to sort of read between the lines and go, oh, they were using a conditioning process to make this happen. They were training them. But it training just often in a lot of circles is such a bad word that we usually have to talk about it in so many other ways. But yes, there are lots of examples of really groundbreaking work that has been done in the 30s, 40s, 50s, that's been going on for a long time, that has been training related.
Yeah, I was gonna. So my endeavors into this is, of course, so, and I had mentioned, I know we were talking a little bit about this, but so whenever this pandemic kind of, it stops me from stops from stopping me from getting to Australia. I so one of the projects I'm doing out in Adelaide. With my faculty position out there, is we have a grant submitted to Morris Animal Foundation, working with the Australian gray-headed flying foxes. And for those of you not that familiar with Adelaide and South Australia, so I'm a co-PI on this grant. I'm second author, and Adelaide is it's in South Australia. And in the summers, they get extreme heat waves that roll through. They get these spikes. When I was there last year, almost exactly a year ago, for my interviews for this faculty position, I didn't take it as seriously as I probably should have, and I ended up putting on the hottest day was the day of my interviews, and I wore a suit for 12 hours, and they were telling me the temperature in Celsius, and my Americanese was not computing what that meant until I looked it up later and realized it it was 100, and so for Americans here, it was gosh, I don't remember what it was in Celsius, but it was I think 100 and not was it 108, 118? One of those two, either 108 or 118. It was insane. And I got heat stroke from being in that for, so these heat waves roll through in Adelaide. You know, Adelaide has this large population of gray-headed flying foxes. They're right there on campus. It's amazing to see. I saw them. I mean, hundreds of bats. These are Macrocoraptora. So these are 4-foot wingspan bats. These are, by the macro should be a hint there. Bats are split up into the micro and Macrocoraptora. And Microcoraptora is what us Americans and most people are used to dealing with. They're the little, you know, look like mice with wings. They're cute. They're adorable. I think all bats are adorable. But the Macrocoraptora look like lemurs with wings. They are really that size. They're enormous, and they have this large population. And when these heat strokes come through, the bats have some responses they do to this, natural behavioral responses, and they'll consume water and whatnot to try to thermoregulate on their own. But invariably, bats drop and they die. They get a few hundred that have to be rehabilitated. So we have this grant into Morris Animal Foundation on providing sprinklers for these bats and looking at their response patterns to it. But the big part of where I come in and what I had been pushing, and exactly what you're talking about here, Ken, is I'm talking not about training, not about conditioning, but I'm talking about, you know, what would be great is if we get these sprinklers to work in this next phase. I bet we could individualize some of those sprinklers, and we could probably connect them to some motion sensors, and then that might enable those to be activated when a bat comes close to them. Anybody see the things I'm talking about here, right? So I have just thrown in, for the second phase of this project, training bats in the wild to use little water fountains and individualized or small group sprinklers. And they, you know, my co-authors love this. And I've never mentioned the word training or conditioning in this, because when you mention training to a conservation scientist, they often say, we don't have time for that. Or they'll say things like that, and they miss that. So, and I'm already talking. So going back to, I mean, all this is really exciting, and to see how training can be used in conservation science. And I know Stephanie had asked a question about, there's a couple questions coming up here. I mean, I think, Stephanie, these are some examples of how training principles can be used in wildlife conservation context. And I think both Ken and I are in 100% agreement on this, and that you have to kind of use the right words. Often that means not saying training or conditioning, because conservation scientists often have a different perspective of what that means, or expectation.
Right. For me, it's a little more difficult because people look at me and think of me as a trainer, and so I have a difficult time steering clear of the word. But you're right. A lot of times, the early proposals that are presented to government officials and to research and wildlife biologists, we try to avoid that particular term until they see the benefits of human intervention to help with this particular issue. And then once they've bought into it, I then say what we're really doing is teaching the animals to do this, and we're using some training principles to try to accomplish that. And then once they've bought into the project, they're a little bit more comfortable with that term.
Yeah. By the way, and Stephanie had also pointed out, 108 is 42 degrees Celsius. It was 46 degrees Celsius, I think, is what it got up to while I was there in Adelaide. So that must have been 118, almost 120, something like that. But I got heat stroke from it. But Ken, there was a question. Daniela was asking about what props and methods you use to retrain the matriarch.
Yeah, excellent question. And I'm going to talk about a couple of the main tools. I am not going to talk about the intimate details, primarily because of the fact that we're still involved in the project and we still have poachers trying to derail the project. So I want to avoid sharing anything that would, not that I think any of the poachers are actually listening to this particular broadcast, but nonetheless,
You
it
never
is a
know.
wise, it is a wise thing that I've learned to be careful about how much information we share while we are in the middle of the project. Um, it's also important to know that, like you asked the question, Stephanie, about what did we use to uh, to deal with the matriarch. It was more than just the matriarch. One of the things that's important to realize about a herd of 400 plus elephants is that when they migrate, uh, if you stand in one place and watch them migrate, it's not like they're here and then they're there in 1 minute. That entire herd migrates by one particular location over the course of 14 to 20 hours. And in a herd that size, there are a number of sub matriarchs, and those sub matriarchs were really interesting because oftentimes when the sub matriarch would come up, they would almost question why is everybody going that way? That's not the way we're supposed to go. And so we used two different major tools. One was we worked with contractors in Zambia to build a major wall that was built out of trees, and the elephants happened to migrate through a valley that goes through these mountains, and so it was possible for us to block the entire access to that valley. It was a massive wall. It was very expensive to put up, but what we had learned over the years, they had tried blocking the route before with fences and things like that, and the elephants just pushed right past them. But we put a substantial wall, but then combined with that barrier, we used man-made watering holes along the new route to reinforce them for moving along that route.
Yeah.
And there are a few other techniques that we used as well to make going toward the wall aversive and toward make going the other route positive. But what was amazing about it is the number of animals that really even tested the wall were very, very minimal, and it's gotten less and less each year. And after 3 years, we actually had no animals really test the wall or even move toward it. By the third year, we've moved the wall further away from the detour route. If you look at the old route goes one way and the new route goes the other way, there's this Y, this juncture where they split. And that was the place we had to focus our attention on the first year. And there were a number of animals who wanted to go the old route. And we had none of them even really look toward the old route, except for one young male elephant who seemed to be playing games with us this year. But generally, they went the correct route. So our goal over the course of the next 7 years is to move the wall out of view. It will still be there should someone decide to go the other way. They won't be able to get through, but we're trying to eliminate the visual barrier and slowly but surely eliminate the watering holes so that eventually at the end of 10 years, the idea is this is just the new route and there needs to be no human intervention to make it happen. Um,
Yeah.
the the cost of putting these watering holes in is huge, and even worse, the government required us to have them all removed at the end of the migration, so we have to redo it every single year because of the impact on other wildlife should they be left there. So
Yeah, these things are. By the way, and Ken, you're like you're being very nice about describing these things without throwing in all of the hurdles that because one of the things I was just going to mention is that what many people might not realize is that elephants, particularly African elephants, both of the subspecies, they're jerks. So uh, I've only done research with one older female African elephant. I spent a little bit of time, even with some free contact with African elephants at Indianapolis Zoo, um, which is dumb. But I don't even know what it's like with them in the wild. But they can be. I mean, even the older female who I spent a lot of time at Woodland Park Zoo, the African female we had there, who I would be behind the scenes working with the figuring out things with the keepers. She had met me, I had fed her, and still on every time of meeting her, she would just boom, ears out at me. And they can really, these are not animals you want to mess around with too much. So I
No,
can only
they,
imagine.
yeah, they're very dangerous. And when you're blocking a route that they normally would take, one of the things that one of the conservation groups in Zambia had tried for several years was building fences to block their approach, and the elephants just barreled through them. And then these
Right.
are substantial fences. And so the difference, of course, is in this behavioral approach, not only did we block their route with a substantial barrier, but we also reinforced them for moving the correct direction that we wanted. And so that helped a lot because we gave
Yeah.
them an option. I think what happens without the option, if that's the only route the elephants know, they just gather there figuring out how do we get through this barrier that wasn't there.
I can only imagine. There, it's pretty, and just seeing some of that. I mean, it sounds. I would imagine the amount of low grumbling that you're getting with them figuring out some of these things is pretty amazing. By the way, I was going to throw in one other thing, and this was one of the other things you were being fairly nice about too. But Kent, you had mentioned your group was under attack in the process of working on this project. I think, didn't one of your Jeeps or trucks take an RPG
Yeah,
directly?
the one that I was in, we got hit. I was thrown from the Jeep and hit a tree and had a concussion and then was in a coma. My partner, who was in that Jeep, was hospitalized and almost died from a variety of injuries from that. It was a very serious attack on our on our on our group. If you're interested in reading more about it, if you go to Karen Pryor Clicker Training website, I wrote an article on it called "The Steep Price of Conservation," and I talked a lot about that particular experience. It was a really, really difficult experience, and one of the hard things about conservation training in general is that you can have all the ideas in the world of what you want to accomplish, but the number of people putting obstacles in your way, whether it government officials, animal rights groups, conservation groups, biologist groups, all with different opinions, and there was no shortage of people who felt really certain that this was a bad idea and that it wasn't going to work. And then you also have to get local buy-in. I remember I was involved with a Mexican gray wolf introduction project here in the United States, and a lot of excellent effort went into the project. And then when it was time to release the wolves into the forests of Montana, uh, ranchers in that area were like, "What are you doing? We don't want the wolves. We're glad they're
Right.
gone." And so, unless you get buy-in from the locals and the people who live in that area, and so one of the interesting things about the Zambian project was the government issued us permits, but we were advised that if we wanted this project to go smoothly, that we needed to meet with local tribes along the route and get their permission as well. And while our government permission was sufficient from a legal perspective, the reality was if we didn't get buy-in from the local tribes that were along that route, we could run into problems, and the government wasn't going to be able to guarantee that we wouldn't reach opposition. And so we went and held meetings with tribal elders of various groups all along the way to get those permissions. And so it was, and then the number of of petitions to not allow the project. You know, we had every imaginable group, the Friends of the Hyena, the Zebra Advocate group, the this group, who were concerned about what impacts this project would have on those animals. And so part of the process is doing these environmental impact statements and answering those questions. What have you done to make sure that the hyenas, that the zebras, that this group or that group aren't going to be impacted by this in a negative way or in an adverse way? So it's a huge undertaking, and it requires a lot of patience just to see the project to fruition. I'm involved in a couple of conservation projects right now that we've been working on uh, for going on 20 years and still have not yet seen success. And so when I can talk about one that is successful, like this elephant project, it's very gratifying.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of that with the Flying Fox project that the grant that I'm a co-PI on, I get to avoid a lot of those issues, which is really fortunate. Um, and we're all academicians, um, and all of the people on the grant and the PI has been doing rehabilitating these flying foxes in Adelaide. He's the bat guy in Adelaide, so we get to avoid a lot of the issues with who's not happy with this or that. But we'll see what happens if and when we're successful, because that's when people start, coming in and then intervening. Nonetheless, I was going to jump into. I know Anna had a question. She actually is mentioning this article, this paper that just was published. How to Train Your Wildlife, I think is the name. I was actually a reviewer on that paper, which I gave it a big thumbs up to get published. Um, I don't remember what my review specifically said because I've done a lot of reviews, but it was close to a year ago when I did the review on that paper. But I'm looking at her question here. Yeah, because they don't. That was one of the things that I even mentioned as a reviewer on that paper. About reinforcement-based approaches to teaching predatory avoidance in wildlife. Um, that paper just went through some of the different things that happen with trying to it was a lot of fish in that paper from what I remember, and how to a lot of it was more environmental management. There wasn't really much in the way of training, certainly not operant conditioning. So I don't have a ton of insight into, I mean, Ken certainly has a lot more that he can say about this. I mean, I think both of us have already said part of this, which is that it you often avoid talking about the use of the term training itself, even conditioning. I found a little bit, but Ken, I don't know if you want to address some of this about talking about uh, predatory avoidance training, avoidance.
Yeah, it's a really common one. I mean, a lot of the areas where conservation training it has been asked for to come and help have been often in a lot of the human animal conflict that occurs in places. But you also have a lot of challenges with um, because of human encroachment, animals end up changing their where they live, and all of a sudden you have an endangered species that is being eaten and um, uh, being decimated. And so there is a lot of effort to try to teach the avoidance thing. But as most of us who are used to using training in anything that we do, simply teaching an animal not to eat something can be a difficult process if you aren't giving them an alternative thing to eat. So part of the challenge is often finding an alternative source of nutrition that is adequate and palatable and something that that animal really wants. Um, and often you do have to use an aversive tool to get them to avoid the one thing, but you also need to work hard at finding an alternative behavior, an alternative source of nutrition that will also work for them. And so that becomes the challenge. And anytime you start manipulating uh, the environment like that and changing it, you run the risk of, okay, they quit eating this, but now they're eating this, and that's now becoming depleted. And so there's a lot of work that has to look into, you have to look into finding appropriate sources of nutrition that would be natural for that particular species to eat. Um, and then there are other efforts that we have made to do just that. And what you find is you can train a cohort of individuals to avoid a certain type of food, but often what happens is as soon as they move on to a new source of food, a new cohort of that same species will come in and take over eating. So they just replace they get replaced. So it becomes a bigger issue. So often when we're looking at a conservation project, and because I've worked on many of them, I kind of have an approach now that I take, and I say, okay, what is the problem here? And is the problem uh, that they're eating this one particular species of that you want to protect? Is there an alternative source of food for them? What is it that has drawn them to that? Often they're drawn to that source of food either because it's the most tasty thing available, or they're drawn to it because of the ease in hunting for it or the ease in acquiring it. And so the question becomes, can you make it more difficult for them to acquire that particular species, but at the same time make it easy for them to acquire another one? And as soon as you start asking those questions, lots of caveats are popping up about why that particular species would not be a good alternative, or what other impacts that might have on the environment. And so there are a lot of ethical considerations when you make decisions about how you're affecting these animals' behavior. There's no question that if you put a good training plan in place, you can change the behavior. The question becomes, is that really an appropriate use of the tool? And what other impacts are you having on that environment? And so those are all questions that have to be asked.
Yeah, one of the things I think, excuse me, one of the things that, and this is going to get into enrichment, which is one of our other topics that we were talking about. But one of the things that can be difficult is that I think the way that many people that don't do training, that don't do any form of training, animal training, and particularly in conservation science, they think of operant conditioning, they think of any training procedures as being contrived, because they are. So, and they're trying to get this natural behavior. So that's part of where the conflict can be and why they want to avoid that. It actually was, as Ken mentioned as well, it was a problem in the zoo world. So people like Hediger and Morris and whatnot were trying to produce wildlife exhibits in captivity, and they were trying to minimize the interactions that anyone, including keepers, had with the animals. They wanted the animals to basically not know that people existed while they were there. Um, and what was really interesting about that, just to kind of I know we can come right back around to conservation, but just as a somewhat of a segue, is that when it was actually a behavior analyst, Hal Markowitz, who in the 70s was the first person to really start talking about behavioral engineering. Now, granted, the Brelands actually talked a little bit about this. I mean, they already had Keller Breland wrote a paper back in '62, a little one-page paper about making naturalistic exhibits with contingencies. There were many examples of this that like Hediger and others did, but Hal Markowitz was the first person to be able to bring this contrived um, very ABC oriented approach into zoos. And he was in a top management position with what's now the Oregon Zoo, and brought some of that there. And he said, you know what, I want we have white-handed gibbons that are sitting on the floor. They're not doing anything. I want them to swing. So I'm going to start training them to swing by putting up this device up here and this device up here. And now they've got to hit this device, and then it triggers this other device, and they come over and hit this device, and then they get rewarded. So the best way to do that is swing across the top of the cage, and things like that. But yeah, so I was going to let you jump in there because we were talking about well, that was one of the topics we wanted to talk about, was enrichment in general, and where that started, where that went.
Well, what's interesting about that is that when I started really working on a lot of these projects, I was really looking for information on remote training. And not only did I come across a lot of this work that Hal Markowitz had done, but I was also really inspired by a lot of the work that the Brelands and that Bob Bailey did. Because when you looked at some of the stuff they were doing with the IQ Zoo and some of the shows that they were doing for fairs and so forth, they were getting these animals to perform these behaviors without a trainer being obviously present, yet they were still engineering it so that the animals would do these things. And I got so much inspiration from a lot of those kinds of papers out there. And a lot of people say, well, that information isn't readily available, but actually it is. And I really have to tip a nod of my hat to people like Bob Bailey, who I know is here. I just saw in the chat window that he's leaving in a few minutes, but I've always been inspired by the kind of work that he has done, because he's done a lot of this kind of work, and people just aren't aware of it, or don't know where to look for it, but the information is out there, and it's when you start designing some of these conservation projects, you're really relying on on these techniques that have been used to engineer behavior for enrichment or to train animals for shows. They have been in use for a long time, and the knowledge is there. You just have to sort of mine for it a little bit.
Yeah, that's I talk Bob, I know before you go, I'll have to send you the paper. Ken has seen it. It's out for review now, but Bob was instrumental in getting me some older papers from Curtis, from Breland, for this. I've done a review of training as enrichment, and it's now out to review. I finished that paper last week, I think. I don't know. I submitted it. That's all that matters. The paper is submitted for publication. It'll come out hopefully, as long as we'll see what the reviews say. But nonetheless, I go over a brief history of modern animal training and a brief history of environmental enrichment, behavior analysis having played a big part in both those. And the work of the Brelands and Hal Markowitz were the two biggest contributions to both those fields. So it's pretty amazing that that's one thing I remind behavior analysts. So people doing human clinical work, nothing with animals. I say, the two modern practices used in zoos for behavioral welfare, the two major practices, husbandry training procedures and environmental enrichment, were started by behavior analysts. So it was started by the Brelands and Hal Markowitz. So that's pretty amazing in and of itself. But Ken, you were mentioning this word, you kept talking about engineering, which is what Hal Markowitz referred to it as. So thanks, Bob. Thanks for showing up.
Thanks for joining us.
So you were mentioning this term in engineering, and Hal Markowitz kept referring to what he was doing originally as behavioral engineering,
Yeah.
which what then turned into the term behavioral enrichment. By the way, the interesting part, I had talked with Hal a little bit about this. I didn't mention this in the enrichment history, but it's part of Hal Markowitz is he passed away a number of years ago, but pretty amazing individual. He was a behavior analyst that then got into this management position in the 70s at Oregon Zoo, as I was mentioning. And in 1982, the first use of the term behavioral enrichment showed up in his book called Behavioral Enrichment in the Zoo. But Hal Markowitz had spent all that time up until then in the 77, 78, 79, 80, the papers that he was putting out, he talked about behavioral engineering, and then suddenly this word shows up, and apparently it's because the editor didn't like behavioral engineering was a popular applied behavior analysis term to describe what applied behavior analysis was. So operant guys were using this in the 60s and 70s, calling what they did behavioral engineering. So apparently Hal's editor for his book changed the name of the book from behavioral engineering in the zoo to behavioral enrichment in the zoo, and the term just stuck. So that's where we get the term, and then it eventually evolved into environmental enrichment and the like. But nonetheless,
And
yeah.
it's great. The it's not hard to still get most of those publications. Hal Markowitz's work is still being published and it's still available. And I encourage people to look at it because there's a lot of really good information there that
Absolutely.
that really speaks to how I was guided in making decisions from a conservation perspective. But I also want to say that those contributions to enrichment are great, and I really I appreciate Eddie you giving me the opportunity to look at that paper and review it in advance because um, I have always thought of training as being like the number one way of providing enrichment, but one of the things that you brought up in your paper is challenges by people like I think it was Vicky Melfi, for example, who
Yeah.
in your paper you talk about that she said that there are 5 different metrics that she would think need to be followed to determine whether or not it really is enriching. And I think one of the challenge many of us who work in the zoological field face is that we are not very good about publishing. We are not very good about keeping data, or if we are good at keeping data, we don't share it as willingly or as openly as we could. And thus, there is a lack of evidence to support this idea that training is an excellent form of enrichment. But you really went in and looked for it and found actually quite a bit of good information, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, Ken, now you're asking me the questions here.
I I
Uh,
I forgot. See, I do my own show as well, and I often have, and I was putting on my host hat there for a minute and asking you questions. I'm sorry.
No, it's great. This is one of the things that I absolutely love about getting to talk with you, Ken, is because it's both humbling and rewarding at the same time when we get to chat, because you'll and that it's really great to see when you're in conversation with people and you're sitting there wanting to talk about the things that they do, and it's so exciting, and then they turn around and say, how about you, what's that thing that you did? And it's just so amazing. It's great to have that happen. So, but yeah, I think one of the things that I've been presenting on for the past few years now. One of the big parts and really for all of I guess all of my career, but I've placed a big emphasis on this, is data collection for the purpose of practice. So because it's been a big part of applied behavior analysis, and I think just the term data, it's like the word math. It's kind of aversive to a lot of people.
Right.
They think it's some mystifying, like you have to go into the back room and get your lab coat and all these things, when it's data is not, I mean, aside from the fact that there's all different types of data, but nonetheless, data has very useful properties. Mechanics are taking data. Doctors are obviously taking data. They can't do their job without data. If you went to a mechanic, if you went to your car mechanic and you said, this is what's been going on with my car, it's making this weird noise, and he walked up to your car, put his head down on the hood, and went, that's good, right? You'd probably get a second opinion. You wouldn't accept that the mechanic is not going to use data. You just don't call it data.
Right.
Uh, every sports professional is using data. Every football player, every golfer, every tennis player. everything they do is determined by data. It's how far did they get? How far do they have to go? All of that is data. So I think that's important. Now, part of Ken, what you're talking about is that next step of also how do we then, it's not just about evidence for the purpose of being able to demonstrate that you have been a successful trainer, right? It's not just that, but also then can you take that evidence and be able to show other scientists and
Right.
can publish that? And that's a really hard step. And we got to get better about figuring out that bridge between it. Um,
Yeah, I actually think there's a couple of obstacles that we face when it comes to that aspect. One, I believe that we are often too easily satisfied by anecdotal evidence. We are too easily like, yeah, it appears like it's better, so we're going to keep doing it. And realistically speaking, if we're putting a lot of time and effort into this enrichment process or this training process, and we think we're being successful, we really ought to be able to show it just to ourselves at the very least, or to our bosses, so that we can determine, oh, yes, if we're trying to reduce stereotypic behavior, for example, have we done an ethogram to really look at baseline before and what's happening after, and we see an actual reduction in time. If we're trying to see a reduction in aggression, have we looked at a measure for that so that we can see that whatever we're doing is actually causing the aggression to go down? And just looking at it for ourselves would be helpful, because then we're not wasting our time if the process really isn't helping. But then the other challenge that we face is, I know in my early attempts, I am lucky that I have been able to publish quite extensively, but my early attempts at publication was always as a primary trainer on a project. And there was a different individual, someone like yourself, Eddie, who was the principal investigator, who was really going to write the paper and really put all the pieces together. And I didn't have to do the writing. And when I did my first writing of a scientific paper, and I was the principal investigator and doing the writing, I was horrified by the amount of red ink that showed up. That's how long ago it was. It
yeah.
was actually red ink on a piece of paper that came back. And I was like going, oh my goodness, it was so demoralizing and so difficult. So that I think that many trainers and keepers who work in a zoological environment, who are not familiar with the scientific rigorous process of a peer-reviewed journal, um, are put off often because it is so daunting and so difficult that you say, well, never mind, I don't want to publish anymore. And we need to figure out a way to get past that obstacle, because we do need more information out there. There's a lot of great work that trainers have been doing for a long time. It's just not in the literature sometimes.
Yeah, and it can be very difficult. I think that I mean I find myself doing that too, because academia trains you to be kind, as I mentioned to you earlier, academia trains you to kind of be a jerk when it comes to what is the standard, and how do you, so I found myself, I mean, I know I've done that where I've been at a conference and I'm watching somebody's presentation and I'm like, oh, that's garbage, and I've done that. It might not do that out loud, but, and you see that, I mean, you can't go to an academic conference and see somebody stand up and present their data and not, well, you can, but it's not that common. I think it's becoming less common now, thankfully. But you would just see people get attacked
Right.
for what they present. So this is the very, academia is brutal in this sense, and the journals and the reviews. It's one of the reasons why when I review papers, I go out of my way to be as kind as possible and try to find approximations to reward, even if it's something that isn't, that I find, this isn't at that point yet, and it's probably not gonna. This project doesn't have the kind of controls necessary for a peer-reviewed publication. Well, then let me find a way to continue encouraging these people to get to that point, rather than just tell them this isn't getting published, get out of here. Right.
And probably one of the sad things about that approach is that oftentimes, whether it be a trainer presenting at a training conference and people saying, well, that's rubbish, that way of approaching it is rubbish, or whether you're presenting data at a scientific conference and someone's saying it's rubbish, my only concern about that sometimes is that while the science that the trainer was trying to claim was taking place may have not really been accurate, if they were successful as a trainer in getting what they were trying to do, then there's something there that was happening that was worthwhile. Let's not throw it out completely just because they weren't scientifically accurate. And the same thing with data. The data may be rubbish, or the approach they took to collecting the data, but it doesn't mean that they weren't doing something that was worthwhile. It's almost like we need this intermediate sort of guide to help us, those of us who aren't good at scientific publications, to say, let's see how we can reshape that study, or let's look at how we can reword what you did so that it is more accepted by the scientific community. Because that's the challenge I see with a lot of the training stuff that goes out there is people do something, they come up with the protocol and it works for them. Well, if it works for them, then something they are doing is correct. But then because they're not scientists, they decide to write a paper and get up and talk about it. And they say, I used a negative reinforcement procedure, or I used this kind of conditioning procedure. And a scientist jump on it immediately and say, that's not what that was. And they're probably right. That might not have been what that was.
Right.
But it doesn't mean that what they accomplished wasn't correct, wasn't good. They just didn't refer to it by the right scientific name, but they immediately shy away and be like, okay, never mind, I'm not going to do a scientific paper ever
Right.
again. they
Right.
fade into the background because they're afraid of getting out there. And so it's finding, but I understand the need for that rigor, but at the same time, I wish there was a gentle way of easing people into that rigorous community, because I think there's a lot of good things that trainers could offer to the world. Just because, but they get discounted because they don't speak the lingo or something.
Yeah, that's part of, I mean, this is all stuff. This is part of what I've at least made part of a career. I've tried to make part of a career, not so well at times, but tried to do something that is really helping people that may not have a scientific training understand and appreciate data, and then also find ways to be able to use data, and then potentially do things that are that are worthy of publishing. So that in and of itself, I mean, I get thrilled by that. Look, I know I'm nerdy enough to just love data. Like I know that. Like I know I'm weird and nerdy in that way that I get excited when I see Excel spreadsheets, and I recognize that other people may find that not so exciting. So I'm always trying to be empathetic towards what's the experience, what do they think? Because I will say this is the one part that I really, and I found myself wanting to be aversive to other scientists when I've seen them do this. And in my past I have been aversive to other scientists. Now I go, wait, that's hypocritical. So I stop myself as much as I can. But when I see scientists that hoard information and they sit there, they do this sink or swim mentality where they're like, you know what, I punish the hell out of all my grad students. They have to undergo this extremely aversive experience, because then the ones that emerge and actually do good science and publish, those are the ones that are going to be the good academicians. And it's that same mentality you see pushed forward by balanced trainers, by traditional trainers in many cases, where they're, oh, yep, I'm just gonna do this enough with all these dogs. I'm just gonna keep doing it, and I know the good ones because they're that 1% or that 5% or whatever it is that survive my terrible experience, right?
Yeah, and it's so true. And I've seen it in, I was very athletic and I was in sports when I was in high school and college. And I have very aversive coaches, very, very aversive coaches.
Yeah.
And and the people who rise to the top are the good athletes who also can accept all that criticism. And what you often see is, yes, that approach to critiquing and trying to make the best scientists possible, it works only because, in the sense that if the community is going to be aversive in that way, it prepares them to be in that aversive world. It's just a shame that it needs to be that aversive, because the reality is, as an athlete who was working with aversive coaches, I saw some really talented and skilled athletes fall out of the program simply because they didn't want to be abused and mistreated by these coaches, and
Absolutely.
they missed out on some really good talent. And that's too bad. That's really the sad part about it, is whether we're talking about training or science or coaching. um there's advantages. I certainly think I was resilient because I grew up in a very aversive environment, and so for me, I've learned to be resilient to that. But there's a lot of good people that are passed over if they're not resilient, if they're not able to overcome because of that. And that's an obstacle that I think we face in the scientific community.
Well, I was going to say, Ken, there's one part about that that is really, you had a Mexican mother. I had Cuban parents. I know what a punisher is from that parenting experience. What truly aversive experiences you can undergo under those conditions. Yeah. I'm already bringing back memories. Yeah, no, it's really, I actually have tried to make that one of my life goals is, I mean, look, my parents were great. They were fantastic. They did a wonderful job. But they didn't know what they were doing, and they were just, wildly swinging different objects at us half the time. Um, and it was really, I know my training, I know my experience with interacting with a lot of people, especially early in, and maybe that drew me to academia because I saw it as that sink or swim opportunity. But I know I spent a lot of my life being incredibly aversive, and still, I mean, I catch myself doing it, falling into those old habits. I think that's typical for many people. Um, and we have to, it's those are life goals, those are things you unlearn. So I think that's a really relevant component to this, is how much it's not just I mean, Murray Sidman, and good old Burris himself. So Skinner and Sidman wrote books about how punishing, how aversive, how coercive society is, right? So
Yeah.
we this is a very, I mean, Sidman's coercion and its fallout, and then every one of, Skinner spent 90% of his time, I jokingly throw out that percentage, but it's probably not that far off, either talking about stuff that was relevant to emotions, thoughts, and feelings, or talking about how aversive society in general was. You pick up about behaviorism, you pick up beyond freedom and dignity, you pick up science and human behavior, and that's what most of those books are.
Mhm.
So it's extremely relevant, and finding ways to make that data collection process, get more trainers involved in that. I don't know what the answers are here. I know at least some simple steps towards those answers, which is starting to find ways to get trainers to be able to use data, to collect data themselves in ways that is useful for them.
Right.
That,
I also think it's interesting because we're talking about aversives and our parents and things like that. It brought me back to my younger days when I was learning to be a trainer, and it's amazing to think about how we were brought up and how that's changed in the way I approach dealing with people. And I'm not going to focus on the aversive part of it right now, but I am going to talk about that early in my career. I was thrust into a training situation in which uh, my I wasn't taught. I wasn't being taught how to train. I was just thrown into the deep end, and I learned to train, and I made lots and lots of mistakes. And I recognize that I am a better trainer for having made those mistakes. However,
Right.
today, when I'm introducing new trainers to how to train, I don't allow them to make those mistakes. I set them up for success and guide them down the path of learning. And then I find myself wondering, am I cheating them of the opportunity to learn from those mistakes? But at the same time, if I want the animal to benefit, and I don't want the animals to suffer, because I know that my mistakes as a young trainer caused harm to animals, or certainly slowed down their learning, and we don't want to set our animals up for failure. So we try to teach, and through that errorless learning process, the new trainers of today that I'm working with have hopefully learned a really good skill set. But there was a period of time when I worried that they weren't going to get the benefit of having made all of these mistakes. I've since realized that that isn't necessarily a problem. If you've set them up correctly, they end up learning the right way, and they don't have to make mistakes to realize the errors of those mistakes and the problems with those mistakes. But it was a real dilemma for me as I was coming up, because I learned so much from all that punishment and all those mistakes. And now I'm trying not to use that kind of teaching with my students, so with my children, with the people that I work with. And I was conflicted for a long time. I don't feel that conflict anymore, because I've really resolved where I want to be and what kind of trainer I want. But that's the kind of conflict you see with a lot of people, because I learned this way, so it must be a good way to learn. And so there's that experiential part of it that you have to overcome.
Yeah, it's funny. I do that all the time too, and I find myself saying that. It's such a weird idea to think that we're supposed to learn from our mistakes, but I do that all the time. That I say, oh well, that person's just been coddled. They're not going to really know what it's like in academia until they get here, or they're not going to really know what it's like to train an animal until they work with this kind of animal that's just going to beat them up, or whatever it is that I'm referring to. That I find myself doing that, and it's one of the reasons why, and I say this all, I tell my students this, I say this all the time, where I say, don't believe your own bullshit. That's one of my sayings, right? Which is to mean, like, all of us, we all have these weird things stuck in our brains, well, wherever they are. We have these weird beliefs, um, and that's perfectly normal to have beliefs that are based on your own learning history. It doesn't mean you have to believe them, right? So you don't. So I want to sit there and go, do that kind of, like, get off my lawn, you crazy kids, kind of like, the kids today aren't getting all the mistakes that we had to do. I had to walk through this amount of snow or whatever. That's what that is, all that kind of talk, right? Where it's, you have to experience this terrible thing. But think about all the things that we learn without having to make those mistakes. I mean, if we had to make those mistakes like that to learn how to drive cars, that would be terrible, right? We don't all have to walk up and touch a hot stove to learn that's a bad idea.
Right.
So why are we emphasizing this need to have all these aversive experiences to learn? It seems like such a weird um, uh, thing that we can stop ourselves and just go, you don't have to believe that bullshit.
Right, right. But I think the challenge that people like me face is that as I go out into the world and I work with law enforcement agencies, I work with search and rescue trainers, I work with guide dog trainers, I work with assistance dog trainers. You do find um, a history there that that people do what's worked for them in the past. And so you find yourself having to find arguments, reasons for them to make changes. And I've been fairly successful at it, but it's always been a challenge. And you feel like every time you enter into a new organization with the goal of helping convert them to positive reinforcement and convert them away from using aversives, you feel like, okay, here we go, fight that
Right.
fight all over again. Now, the
Right.
good news is the more we fight the fight and make the changes, the more data is developed that you can actually point to say, look at how this has helped this organization succeed, and look at how this has caused failure and to diminish because of the techniques that they're using. And once you have that data, it gives you a place to start. But you still start like in a fighting position because they're resisting you, and you have to sort of go down that pathway. But the good
Yeah.
news is it is getting easier because we do have data now in each of these different communities that has really helped, at least in most of them. It's interesting because I think you and I probably had a discussion about this once where in law enforcement we've been able to have data that illustrates why um, using positive reinforcement is really beneficial to explosive detection dogs. And then we had another set of data for law enforcement that helped show them why it was helpful for drug detection dogs. But what was interesting is I still have trouble with data, finding good data that illustrate how positive reinforcement is helpful in search and rescue. And part of the reason for that is that often, if I'm a search and rescue dog trainer, I don't want to show you my data if I'm not successful, because why would I want to show you that I'm not being successful? But more importantly, most search and rescue dog teams go out and there's 2 or 3 or 4 dogs spreading out over an area looking for a dog, and one of the dogs ultimately finds the victim. And so it was a successful search. My dog may not have found the lost kid, but we found it as a team. We found the lost kid. And what ends up happening is there isn't a requirement to keep that kind of data. And it's possible that my dog could go out on dozens and dozens and dozens of searches, and every single one of those searches was successful. But my dog never ever found the lost person. It was other dogs on the team, other members of the team that found it. And so my success or lack thereof isn't really being evaluated. And i've I've yet to find a metric that is useful, partly because most search and rescue teams aren't keeping that data, but it's hard to really measure it as successful as easily as we've been able to do with explosive detection and narcotic detection. With explosive detection, as soon as a bomb goes off, you know what dog cleared that area. And
Right.
so it's very, very evident very, very quickly. And so there's this desire to correct it and change it and make it better. With drug detection, it's a different issue, but with drug detection, the ease with which offenders get their case thrown out of court is huge. And so if you're able to show that through certain training techniques, you can get your case not thrown out and get your case to stand up in trial, then that makes you successful. There are measures that we can use in those two areas, but with search and rescue, we have a little bit more difficulty finding an adequate measure.
Yeah, I was gonna say, most of the search work that I know of any research, um, is, people like the Auburn group, but they're doing, bomb detection stuff, right? So they're doing, so you're right, the bomb and drug dog stuff, you can get valid data there, but I don't, and unfortunately, I know Mara, you were asking about this as well about, um, so in terms of like potential publications, to address things like punishment is natural or use all the tools, so the balanced trainer kind of concept, I will say You know, so I have a talk on ethics, because I actually pit a lot of this more as an ethical discussion, so much as a science discussion. And I just Ken, I'll have to share with you the ethics talk that I just gave for Pet Professional Guild for their PPG Geek Week um, in November. So because I've been trying to formulate different ways of talking about ethics and in animal training procedures and how that's relevant. But so there is some research, there is some stuff. Daniel Mills, China Mills, a few other, they have some stuff on the use of shock, and some of the fallout from that. So there's a quite a number. Ken, you probably know a few more papers as well, on the effects of comparing different types of training methods. There's a few papers that have been published now on this topic.
Yeah, and one of the things that has been, first of all, I'm a big fan of going down the route of choosing positive reinforcement tools for ethical reasons, and not trying to make some artificial claim that punishment doesn't work. Of course, punishment works,
Right.
but the data that we use in law enforcement and in guide dogs, what we've done is we do have, most of these disciplines do keep good data. They do keep good information about success and lack of success. And so in several law enforcement agencies where they use punishment, we were able to show that they were having a certain percentage of success that was lower than that would have be considered acceptable. And then we compared it to these programs where we switched to positive reinforcement. And while we couldn't directly point to positive reinforcement as the reason for the improvement, because we made multiple changes. In other words, when you are not setting out to collect specific data, but are just setting out to improve a program, often you may make 5 or 6 changes to the program. And in the end, when those 5 or 6 changes are made, you're able to see a 20 to 30% improvement in the results. That's significant data. Now, can you say that it was just the positive reinforcement because you also changed this, and this? No, you can't. But what you are able to show is when you put together a program that includes positive reinforcement, includes all of these other things, that we were able to see major improvement in the success of those searches. That was enough to convince many, many people to move forward. Sadly, because we didn't just change the positive reinforcement aspect, we changed a lot of other things. But the most significant thing we changed was the positive reinforcement training. It made a huge, huge difference. And comparing those data is really, really helpful. Similarly, in the guide dog world, we're seeing similar data come out. Guide dogs for the blind in California and Oregon have been using positive reinforcement almost exclusively now for a number of years. And so there has been enough time for the data to develop and for them to be able to illustrate the differences between 20 years ago and today. And it's quite remarkable, the data. But you have to be able to compare the data, and what we saw in the guide dog world was not only shortened training times, fewer tune-up times, but we also saw an increased working longevity. Often guide dogs generally have a working life of 6 to 6.5 years, and they just get burned out. They're just not able to work for that much longer. And have begun to see guide dogs having working lives of 8 years or more. And when you're seeing a dog that's able to work for a year and a half or 2 years longer on average, because of the use of positive reinforcement, those are the kind of comparative data that really helps sell your decision to move to positive reinforcement. It's why more guide dog organizations are moving in that direction. It's why more law enforcement agencies are moving in that direction. But it wasn't because the ethical argument was a good one, but in the end, what they needed to see was that their performance, their work performance actually improved. And once we were able to show that, that really made a huge difference. And that's what I'm lacking still in in the uh, in the search and rescue community. But
Yeah,
working toward it.
well, part of that is getting some of this data published, which is part of your original point about like how do we get to there. And I think it's a really tough, how do we get to there? It's part of what I've been trying to do, not so much in the dog training community, but in general for the animal training community as a whole, which was part of the purpose of that review, of the training as enrichment review, is just even talking about the training experience, which is primarily positive reinforcement training, that has an enriching function.
Right.
But really, at the end of the day, it's data. Data is what makes part of this argument. If you want to be able to prove to people, I mean, it's great to make them like, talking about the ethics and talking about how the animal feels, the experience of the animal, how you're going to feel, all those kind of things are great, right? I mean, that's certainly an argument worth being made. But at the end of the day, if I go to a business and I say, you know what, you're going to be doing better for your customers, you're going to feel better about the food you serve, and then another person shows up and says, you're going to make more money if you do this, you better believe the business is going to be more interested in the latter part, right? So if you're telling this business you're going to have more effective dogs and this is what our data is showing us, is when you're using this procedure versus that procedure. And this is the same way that you can say this for consulting as well. If you can say, you know what, this is what your dog was looking like this is how much your dog was barking. This is how much your dog, I throw barking out there. I don't mean to, whatever the behavior, these are the behaviors that were going on. And since this is how this has changed now, these are the kind of numbers that I think are useful for practice to be able to generate. And that's part of now, at the end of the day, how do we generate that data in the most ideal form so that it's not cumbersome for the consultant, for the trainer? That's part of what I'm working on, and I'm really bad at it. I will tell you that much. I'm getting better at finding ways. I've done some workshops. Sandra's here, and she was at one of my workshops in Germany. So she could probably tell you more specifically about how bad I was a year ago with that. But we're getting to that point of trying to find ways to produce useful data for trainers, for purely applied purposes, not to publish. Now, building that bridge is important too, obviously, and getting more data published on these effects is really important. So I got my hands in a lot of different places. A lot of there's a lot of juggling going on there for different stuff. So I couldn't remember the proper idiom there, so I had to just default to just saying whatever. It's a lot of stuff that's being juggled. So, oh well, Sandra's being very nice. And we had some small accomplishments in using data. So, but I agree, and I think now I will say this, part of what you're talking about, Ken, and this is one of the exciting things about when I do get to be in Australia and through my new lab out there, is we have animal behavior undergrads, we have animal behavior graduate students, we have associated programs. I'm working with a clinical psychologist on equine assisted therapy stuff. So I've helped. So there's one. She's in the clinical psychology graduate program there, and I'm using help very loosely there. I've helped edit and be an author on one of her papers, and she's part of I am much smaller. I am a much smaller part. Susan Hazel's been incredible in influencing some of her work as well, in being the primary influence from our program. And we have vet students. We have a vet school, so that we will have a lot of opportunity to do a lot more applied relevant data collection, not just for the science, but the practice. And part of my contribution is creating one of the first ever applied behavior analysis with animals courses that is part of an academic core curriculum. So, and that's going to be a big emphasis of that course, which will be taught in March, whether I am in Australia or not. So we will have that for undergraduate, graduate students, and vet students.
That's
So if,
good.
yeah, if for people who are looking for opportunities, eventually, well, I would say just come out to Adelaide and become a grad student, or a vet student. That's one option. But if that's not, eventually, I think we'll start putting stuff out there, online resources as well. So
And sort of to bring this topic full circle, it so happens that I have a lot of pending and ongoing conservation projects in Australia and in New Zealand. And one of the challenges that I face is that because I'm so far away, I'm not able to be there to actually implement the training, and I'm often trying to implement the training through other people. And I'm always looking for skilled trainers and skilled data analysts to help with some of these projects. And so I may be knocking on your door figuratively to see if some of your graduate students might want to help with some of these projects.
if it happens literally, I'm going to be excited too, but at every level. So you are all the literal or figurative door knocking. If we get you to come visit um, uh, Adelaide, and you get to see my lab once that gets up and running, and you get to see the school, which is amazing in and of itself. You get to see the other labs and some of the work, hopefully some of the flying fox conservation work. Some of this Nick Bishop at Adelaide Zoo is amazing. So I think, yeah, I was going to say, I assumed you know Nick as well.
Nick, yeah.
Nick and I are going to be working very closely together. And then there's I'm working on some stuff with John Coe, who's out in Victoria, and he's developing a new herptile exhibit with one of their facilities out there, and that's really exciting. We're getting some data collection with that, but there's a lot of stuff going on in Australia. So it will be very exciting to get some good applied relevant data for everything from companion animals to the zoos. Those are my two interests, but we also have some stuff with farm animals that's going on out there as well. So it's pretty exciting.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we're getting, I mean, the simple answer to all of this, if I'm trying to come up with a surmised statement along these lines, is that we're working on approximations of getting data that is both relevant to scientists and relevant to practitioners. That's where we're at. And that's what you have to focus on, is those approximations.
Mhm.
We all know that, right? As people that train using positive reinforcement, using shaping, we know you focus on the approximations. It's nice, and you have a target goal, but you don't expect the target response, right? You get those approximations to target response. And I think those approximations right now are coming in the form of, we're getting more data published. There are people, like I said, Daniel Mills and his colleagues are publishing some stuff comparing training methods. And then there are people like myself working on finding ways for practitioners to be able to use data. And any way that, very approximation worthy statement, a similar thing that I like to say is that any data is better than no data, and no data is perfect. So That's it. So any data is better than no data. Whatever form of data you can collect is useful. It's better than nothing.
Right, right.
Yeah.
And it's really valuable. I always talk to a lot of trainers who are doing consults, just regular everyday consults, and and one of the data can be really valuable if you're working on an aggression problem or whatever the problem is, the dog who with jumping up greeting problems. If you're able to monitor the number of times an incident occurs and are able to demonstrate that the number of incidents are going down, often your client will be much more willing to continue with you and continue to work with you because you're able to show them that the work doing is being successful.
Yeah. Uh, Daniela had mentioned about using regression analysis and other types of inferential statistics to be able to isolate effects of different variables. And yeah, that's very much true. I mean, there are certainly some generalized linear mixed models, GLMMs, that are used ways to identify different factors and their involvement. That's a much more heavy science discussion. I'm happy to have it because I deal with that kind of stuff all the time, and getting into the inferential statistics of being able to derive the level of influence that different independent variables have on some result. And I don't know how foreign any of what I'm saying is sounding. So keep in mind, I know I make sense to myself, and I realize I may not make that much sense in these words I'm using because it's very science speak. The simple answer is there's stuff that can be done to analyze different effects for like what you were talking about, Ken, with the influence of positive reinforcement versus these other factors when you treat them as independent variables and you run them through different models, different statistical models.
And,
So,
I'm very aware that that's true, but when I look at the stuff that Daniela is talking about and what you were just talking about, half that stuff is going
I
way over my head. And it's one of those things where people with good scientific background can pair with people like me who have training experience and figure out how to work together to produce results and an understanding of what's happening. I'm sure I can understand some of these concepts if they were explained to me in a little more simpler terminology, but it definitely goes over my head a little bit, and I'm thinking, okay, sounds good. I don't know what it means, but it sounds good.
Yeah, I usually look, a lot of it is I mean, when you start getting into some of the weird stuff like the Bayesian stuff, I'm lost. But this is why I work with statisticians directly too. And then of course I spend a lot of my time just I play with a lot of numbers. That's a good answer to part of what my job description is I spend a lot of time playing with a lot of numbers. Um, Probably not as much time as I'd like playing with the animals directly, but I do love I love both equally. So weird and nerdy like that. I like the data and the animals that I'm collecting data from. So that was the only way for me to apparently make myself happy in my academic career, was to have both of those on the table at the same time as options, which is getting to spend time with animals and data at the same time. So yeah.
Well,
So
good.
yeah, there's a lot of neat stuff with that. Um, Gosh, we've covered a lot of stuff here. I know we had mentioned a little bit about talking, and we got a little bit into enrichment, talking about what enrichment is, history of enrichment, as well as history of training, and past, present, future. Um, Consulting during COVID. That was one of the boy, what a weird world we live in. Um,
The only
so
the only good thing for me during COVID is that a lot of the consults that I do, because I do a lot of consulting in Asia, in Australia,
oh,
um,
yeah.
I've often visited there once a year and then consulted virtually the rest of the time, so that moving to a virtual consult was actually not difficult for me because it's something that I've always done. Uh, Often the facilities I work with, it's just not possible to afford to fly me there on a regular basis, and so I would often set up consults that were virtual. And so switching to that wasn't a new thing for me. It wasn't an unusual thing, but I know for some it's a new world dealing with behavioral consults remotely. And but fortunately, I was used to that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what's that thing you're talking about? Flying? That's a thing that we used to do? That's
Yeah, so haven't done that in a while. I
yeah,
we
it
we were
it's
holding a conference in March, a Clicker Expo in March, and it was right as the CDC was talking about restrictions and things like that. We ended up all being in the location for the conference, and then had to cancel it the day before it was supposed to start. And that was the last time I flew. I flew home from that conference and have not been in an airport since. So,
yep.
and for me, I travel by air a lot. I'm often on the road a couple of weeks out of every month, and so for me to go 10 months now without flying somewhere is unheard of. I've never stayed at home for such a long period of time in years. So that's a novel experience for me.
Yeah, it was a little it was a little crazy. I had a slew of traveling that I had done for several months leading up to December. So the last time I flew was almost a year ago. And that was flying back from Australia. And then before that, I was in St. Louis like right before Australia, and then right before St. Louis, I was somewhere else in the US. I think I was in Florida, and then right before that, I was in Germany and the Netherlands. It was just like a window, like a few months of just traveling all over, going here in the US and outside the US. And now I haven't been on a flight since December. Um, I it sounds like, but it's all very relevant now in terms of what, how are people meeting with clients? How are they talking to clients? How are they, what is that? All of my meetings academically uh, have all had to be online since I'm not in Australia right now.
Sure.
I'm attending lab meetings. Everything that I'm doing, I mean, the simple answer for research for me is that research has been non-existent for a year. So I haven't been directly involved in any research project. Well, no, that's not true because I'm consulting on Sabrina Brando and I have had other people collecting data at multiple different facilities in Mexico, in Belgium, and in the Netherlands, that we've had projects with dolphins, sea lions, and a bunch of different bird species. So I guess I have been involved in data collection, but it doesn't feel like it because it's all been done distance wise, and it's um, so. But I don't think it was that hard of a transition for me, given that I've spent so much time in my career talking to so many people from so many different places around the world that that I'm either consulting with or interacting with on some professional level. So I've had to do that for most of my career. But I think, I mean, I don't know what that's like for people that have to do dog consults, that have to do zoo consults, um, for trying to have effective behavior change. I don't know what insight you have on that concept, Ken.
Well, it's certainly been a big topic of discussion among so many of our trainers and so many of us in the dog training community. But actually, once you sort of have embraced it, you in a lot of cases we find it to be a very effective way to do consults. Often, if you're a consultant who has to come in and work with a dog aggression case or a reactive dog case, often you either, because you're in that animal's environment, you're causing the aggression or causing the reactivity. And by stepping back and looking at it through a computer lens, often you're seeing the dog behaving a lot more normally, and you're able to give better advice. I think the big challenge has been skill acquisition. If I'm trying to tell a client how to do something, what I can do in a
Right.
in-person consult is I can demonstrate it for them. But one of the things that a lot of us who consult virtually do, I've been doing zoo consults virtually for a long time. Um, I just use other animals to demonstrate how that technique works and then explain how they can use it with them. Then they try it, I watch, I give them feedback, and I'm able to actually have a much better longer relationship with the client, because when you fly somewhere or go somewhere, everybody's concerned about your time, and it's short, it's quick, and you go. While in these cases, I can spend 10 minutes watching a session and then go away and come back and look at it the following week. And we're really finding that it's the biggest challenge is making sure that the location where you're going to watch the animal is well lit, and that you can get your camera to your computer to a place to show what it is that you're doing. Um, but even then, I've come up with lots of ways of making that easier and better. And so we're finding it's actually been a quite a successful way to do consults. And I think a lot of trainers who have moved to the virtual form of consultation are going to find that when life returns to normal, that they may still do a lot of those consults virtually. It cuts down on travel time. They're able to get a lot more clients in. Um, I think there will always be some measure of in-person consulting that will be necessary and will continue to happen. But I think a lot of people have found the virtual consults to be very beneficial.
I was gonna say, in terms of the animal demonstrations, you had mentioned you use animal demonstrations. Are you bringing your dog over, or are you doing the, this thing of you have the now this is I was gonna say, see, I don't just have one penguin. I have two penguins on my desk. Okay, so let's be clear about that. But I often, when I would be for data collection, yep, there we go. You have a donkey. Of course you have a donkey, Ken. Um, well, I was going to say there's a polar bear too. But what I actually used to go out of my way for research purposes and for research lab meetings, and I found this to be very useful, and especially with Woodland Park Zoo, when I was doing all these different research projects with hippos and and three different bear species projects and elephants and all these things. I would get little beanie babies were the most effective one that I found for stuffed animals, because you can exhibit the behavior of those animals. So I don't know if that's something that, or you're actually doing a training demonstration.
Well, yes. I mean, what's nice here at the ranch, I have goats, I have alpacas, I have
Yeah.
donkeys, I have dogs. And so I can set up my camera to show off stuff to people and demonstrate how to work. I can work in protected contact. I can do whatever I want to show them. I can still illustrate it for them. And of course I have stuffed animals too. I've got, you name it,
Yeah.
I've got it. But I tend to find showing it with the real animal that moves and responds is usually helpful in getting the point across. But I still have the challenge of the species centric trainer who can't quite fathom what you're talking about when you show it to them on another species. I have the same trouble in the dog world, where if you show something with a little dog but they have a big dog, they aren't able to easily make the connection. But I've gotten better and better at helping them see the way to make the connection, and how to use it with their animal, even though it may not be the same.
See, somebody needs to write this book. I was going to say article, but it ultimately needs to be a book. Is this animal training in an online world?
Yeah.
Somebody needs, it's certainly not going to be me, because I don't even necessarily consider myself an animal trainer. Let's be clear about this. I'm an applied animal behaviorist, primarily on the science end. I've done a lot of training in my career, but I am rusty. I coach training. better than I actually do training. Yeah, Ken's next book, you can do animal training in an online world. That all of these useful tips for, the methodology of how you conduct these consults. I can talk about it from training research assistants. uh, that's the part that, and that's where I'm showing them, this is what this behavior is. If I've got my little beanie baby walrus or hippo, that I'm saying this is what a sit looks like. This is what, so we're so we can operationally define these behaviors that they're collecting data on in an ethogram. And anybody who's ever been a research assistant of mine can tell you how much time I devote to every lab meeting, going through operational definitions with a line of different beanie babies for each animal that we're collecting data on. So that seems useful, but there needs to be better instructions, I think, about this, and at least tips, since it is fairly novel. It's a weird world that we live in now,
It
and
is.
this, like you said, this is pragmatic. Going into the future, even with the vaccines and us getting past this global pandemic, I think it's going to end up being a benefit for people to continue doing this. So there needs to be, I think, better instructions,
Yeah.
uh, behaviorally minded instructions.
Right. Right.
So that it, like Bob has said, that is no truer wisdom itself, is that the training animals is easy. Training people to train animals is the hard part.
Right.
So now we got that extra part in there, which is the training people to train animals through online access or online uh, source. That seems anyway. That's my. I have not much insight into that, but rather ideas of how we could get insight into it.
Well, I've spent a lot of time talking about that over the past 10 months, I will tell you. There are a lot of tricks and cool things that you can do. I don't think we have the time to talk about them now. Uh, Not sure it'll be my next book, but we'll see.
Yeah. So we have just like a few minutes more. I don't know if there were any questions or any other things, Ken, that you wanted to bring up before we're almost out of time here.
No,
Sorry.
I feel like we've had a good discussion on a couple of different topics, and that's been real worthwhile. I haven't seen if there are any questions that we've missed, but other than that, I'm open to any questions that people may have if there's time.
Yeah, it was just a few minutes. No, this has been great, and this is the fun part of this, is that that's almost 2 hours that we've been talking now, Ken, and it breezed right on by. Uh, so
You get a couple of people like you and me together who like talking about training and the science of training, and we can geek out forever. So
right, yeah. Well, okay then. I think if there's no other, oh, here we got Anna was asking. Oh, yeah, yeah. Thank you, for showing up. Yeah, this is. I mean, I think that's part of the. Anna was just saying she likes this style. Just having an informal discussion. I mean, this all really kind of just emerged because Joe Lang and I, Dr. Joe Lang, who we would typically here in Seattle do virtual lunches every couple months or so, and we hadn't been able to do them once Seattle went into shutdown because of the pandemic. So I just said, Joe, you want to just do this online and let other people show up? And he said, yeah. So we did it that way, and now I've just kind of continued doing it, which I think it's a lot of fun to have these informal discussions and just be a free resource for people to be able to have and then go back and see if they want the videos, for trainers that are all of us are sitting here stuck in this pandemic. uh, uh,
yes,
you
we
know
are.
yeah, so um, that's it. So well then I think we'll end that here, and I thank every Ken, especially thank you.
Oh,
um,
thank you.
yeah, this has been wonderful. Ken, we'll just hang around for a second. And everybody else, thank you for coming. Thank you for showing up. I will make this video available later on in the like early to mid next week. It should be up and it'll be on my YouTube channel. So yeah, thank you, Sandra. Thank you, everybody. So it was great. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and we'll stop recording.
Bye-bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.